So welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to have Judith speak for us today. Dr. Judith Murray is an endorsed counselling psychologist and a registered nurse and a qualified secondary school teacher. She's held positions of Associate Professor in Counselling and Counselling Psychology at the University of Queensland, Australia, and registered nurse in Haematology and Oncology in a major Brisbane teaching hospital. She has got so many letters after her name and massive qualifications. I think there's too much for me to mention. Hopefully Judith will let us know a bit more about her. During her talk, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll ask Judith after her talk. Please don't be shy. Please put any questions that you have in the chat. They are very welcome. That is all I have to say. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Judith, who is in Australia, to speak to us today. Over to you, Judith. Thank you.
Sharon, you'll excuse me. It's 10 o'clock at night over here, so I'm kind of trying to acclimatise to where you are in the middle of the day. But it's lovely to make contact with you there. Shara kind of mentioned my professional background, but I suppose my background in this area is I kind of fell into this work a bit like a lot of people who fall into this kind of work. I actually started working loss and grief work over 40 years ago, in terms of I went through the death of 3 babies in a row, and that threw me into that experience. Then later on lost my mum to leukemia, my sisters had breast cancer. So I found myself kind of in this area, but then working from a professional basis. So I suppose what I want to hopefully help you bring to you is there's a lot of science that can actually help us understand it, but it's also what I love is being able to understand the experience a little more. So I will put stuff up on here, hopefully if it'll be able to be explainable, that makes sense to you. If not, please ask at the end. I also believe that the more we kind of know, the less it becomes frightening in some ways of understanding loss. One of the things is, so what I want to do is kind of understand this whole concept of loss. We use the word a lot, but we often don't think about loss. We use it more commonly only in terms of bereavement. Whereas I have a very strong recognition, the work that I've done for years and years and years, is that I have a bit of reputation in Australia, kind of invite me and I'll turn up to any kind of party, basically, because basically I work on a concept of loss. That means I turn up in working with people who have disabilities, with children, I work with illness, I work with prisoners, I work with all kinds of people, arguing that every adverse life event to some extent brings loss into it. So this is actually my preferred definition about loss. So what is loss? Loss is actually an experience. It's a sense of being, that sense of being kicked in the guts. You guys do know that. People who are experiencing what people with cancer experience know that feeling of, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be here. That sense of being absolutely distraught and kind of, hang on, this is not the world I want to be in. That's really the experience of loss. And so that experience is produced by an event which is perceived to be negative by the individuals involved and results in long-term changes to one's social situations, relationships, or cognitions. That's a definition I quite like, in that what it covers is a number of things. The first important thing there is it's perceived to be negative by the individuals involved. It's not about how everybody else perceives the experience. It's about how you perceive the experience of cancer. It's about how other people can't tell you how to experience. There's no right and wrong. It's understanding that experience that's really important. And it certainly leads to long-term changes. Even when there's cure, it still means there's often long-term changes. So in thinking about that, let's just have a look at some of the losses, if we take that definition, that can be involved. And you'll probably have some others that you might want to stick in the chat, think about it. But this is just some of the ones. So there's some really easily identifiable losses, right? The whole loss of the physical well-being. Obviously you don't feel as well as you used to, but the loss of the body also, sometimes some of you have experienced treatment effects that can lead to long-term changes, just the whole loss of your sense of your body, when you're vomiting or whatever you're doing in terms of that. The loss of long-term treatment side effects, often people are not aware of that chemotherapies and things have toxicities that can lead to long-term problems, or surgery has required things. So, people can lose their voice with throat cancers, or early onset menopause, or infertility from young men who have to have testicular cancer. There's these long-term effects that are all about loss too. There's often the loss of the actual body image, hair loss, weight gain, all of these things that are themselves are losses. That's a change that I don't want to be part of. The loss of the anticipated future that people kind of thought this is how it's going to be. We're all 10 foot tall and bulletproof, as we say. And then all of a sudden, cancer comes along and really questions that. But there can be that loss of, is this going to come back again? So that anticipation of possible loss in the future. There's also, for many people, unfortunately, we lose friends who don't get through treatment, and they've become close friends, sitting in the chairs, in the day surgeries and things like that, and the loss of those friends. For some people, it's a loss of occupation, finances, things they can't do again. The loss of relationships for some people, if, other people don't get it, or they're under the stress, marriages break down, or families break down, or whatever those types of things. Loss of control, loss of choice, very much so in that situation. But loss of roles, if you used to be the absolute go-getter in your family, and you were able to organize and run a million different things, work, have kids, do all those kind of things at the same time, there can be that loss of role if you have to then be the one looked after rather than looking after everybody. That's really difficult. Of course, there's obviously the possibility of death that can actually come in many ways. But sometimes there's some really intangible losses that we don't kind of automatically put down, but are really important in often unspoken ways. Things like just having a loss of trust in your own body, a loss of sense of integrity of your own body. You know, uh, uh, Ages before you had cancer, you wouldn't have worried about certain twigs or pains or little things that come up. All of a sudden, there's this loss of trust in the body that can happen. It's a loss of self-esteem if you can feel your body is damaged or defective in some way. Some people will see it that way. Sometimes people will be the loss of others who can't cope, or they may disagree with your decisions that you made. If you decide not to go down a treatment road, or to go down a treatment road, some people will not be able to cope with that. And families really can struggle with that at times. Sometimes it's being different in your relationships for your future. So that fitting in, I call it the round peg and the round hole. Oftentimes what happens is we live in our families where we got so used to being in our families, and we've become a nice round peg that fits in a nice round hole. And that makes the whole family around us, community around us kind of fit. We kind of fit in, we know we fit. Then along comes cancer, and while people will deal with the initial crisis, the problem is that what you've often become is a square peg. You're not the same person. But once the crisis is over, it's almost like the community wants you to go back into your round hole. And the problem is, if you don't fit there anymore, there can be a sense of, oh. We see the same thing sometimes happening with people who've gone through traumatic events, or veterans who return. The world has moved on in the same way, but they are different. And so that in itself can be a loss. Missing out on, things you can miss out on, being a partner or a parent or a grandparent or a sibling. The big thing often for a lot of people is not recognized is the loss of innocence and the loss of safety that people experience. The loss of autonomy when you have to have greater links with the health system and sitting in waiting rooms and all those kind of things that as a healthy person you didn't anticipate. I'm sure you can think of lots of other losses, but I hope what I'm getting through to you is that loss is such an integral part in so many different losses, and each person can have a whole lot of different losses, and each one of those losses experiences a certain amount of grief that goes along with that. So what's grief? Grief is simply the reaction to loss, whatever that happens to be. There's different definitions about it, but really it's that lived experience of grief. It's the stuff you can see on the outside. It's the distress, the upset, the anger, all those feelings that become part of the reaction to loss. But how does that differ from, say, what we mean by grieving? And grieving, I often think about grief. We think about the word mourning, but grieving is kind of, I use that in terms of other losses, not about bereavement, but it's the kind of underlying process. I want to think about it a bit like, when you have a head cold, you sneeze and you do all that's the stuff you can see on the outside, right? What you don't necessarily see is the infective process that's actually causing those symptoms. So, in many ways, what you see is the grief, but what's causing that is the actual grieving. And why is that important to actually think it through a little bit? Is because what you sometimes see on the outside and what is going on the inside can be very, very different things. How many of you, I'm sure, have already learnt to put a face on, you try but what's actually going on underneath you is often much more difficult to deal with. And sometimes, you learn to put a face on for your kids or for other people or other people who don't cope or whatever. But to actually find people that you can actually speak deeply about your grieving of what's going on can be really difficult. There's one other term that I think is really important that's not necessarily part of the literature, but this one to me is really important. This is a definition of suffering. I actually like this very simple definition, and it is that suffering is the width of the gap between what is and what is desired. The greater the gap, the greater the sense of suffering. When many of you think about what you experienced in cancer, all of a sudden the gap between your lived experience of your health and what this might mean and what you would like it to be has widened up. And I see this as the basis of often the way we integrate care for people. And you think about it, some people will try and bring the what is and bring it closer to the what's desired. It's the doctors, it's the treatments, it's the physios, it's all those people who are trying to bring and to cure your cancer or whatever they're doing. They're trying to bring the what is closer to the what's desired. But sometimes we can't make it exactly as it was. And that's where some other people often come in and support us by helping us deal with the loss of the grief of whatever's going on. So I rather like this concept. Suffering is not a question that demands an answer. It is not a problem that demands a solution. It's a mystery that demands a presence. So you probably know that, simply having someone who sits with you is able. I talk to people about the ability to sit in the rubble, to have someone who can simply sit in the rubble with you at times. Doesn't matter, you don't have to be bright, you can be whatever you need to be at that particular time. There's sometimes those people who don't ask you about the cancer. They say, hey, let's watch something ridiculously funny. Let's do something. They seem to know what you need at the time. So it comes down to, for me, this really important thing about your actual experience of grief. What's the experience of living with cancer, the loss of that? When we think about what we mean by the lived experience, this is what you often find it difficult to express to other people because it's so much inside. What people see on the outside is not always your lived experience. And having worked as a cancer nurse, even people's lived experience with the same treatments could be so different in their experience of what that treatment was like. I'm sticking up the same bag of chemotherapy with, basically the same age person, the same gender, whatever it is. And yet the experience of what's going on can be so different. So it's important for us to kind of be aware that experience is not an unstable, it's not irrational. It's the world, it's our way of knowing the world. And I'm going to come back to neurobiology because it's actually important. But when we actually think about any lived experience, whatever it is usually made up of, there's three aspects to it. There's the sensory, there's the sights, the sounds, the smells, all those sensory experiences. There's also the emotional experiences that we experience. But there's also the cognitive and the behavioral, the thinking through. Now, people's lived experience will have a different balance of those. For some people, the sensory experience of having a treatment can be the most overwhelming part of it. That you know, the whole sights, the sounds, the smells, the what's going on is really difficult. For other people, it's the emotional element that's really overwhelming. For others, it's the having to go through and do certain behaviors or whatever. So we need to really understand people's different experiences, because they actually have different blends of that. And it means we need to care. Now, if you don't remember anything else from today, which is possible, please remember this picture. This, to me, when I think of the experience of grief, this is the most important way I think of it. We in Western societies in particular, we have a very, what we call a dichotomous view of the world. Good, bad, happy, sad, healthy, unhealthy. We have a very definite idea of good and bad, and there are two things. Grief is not like that, right? Grief is not one, this or that. Grief is this. At the very same second, you can hold the very worst emotions of your life. You can hold the very best emotions of your life. It doesn't make sense, but that's what's the lived experience. At one moment, you can be hopeless and hopeful. At one moment, you can be angry and loving. You know, grief is this absolute intertwining of some of the most deep experiences of your life and the most difficult feelings of your life mixed up with the most pleasant. So, you know, your loved ones who engulf you and care for you, you can hold your love for them at the same time as you can hate this illness and hold those things at the very same second. It's often why grief is so confusing and why people feel that it doesn't make sense, right? And so that's often, it's this movement is actually really important, that we often talk about dealing with the waves of grief. It's that sense of sometimes that very worst emotion comes over you and then it goes out again. And very, very much. Give you an example. You know, you kind of, you get up one morning, you go, I'm doing really well at the moment. I'm really pretty proud of myself. I've really kind of just taking it slowly one day. I'm doing really well. And then all of a sudden, you know, you drop the grandkids off or the kids off or something, and all of a sudden that overwhelming sense of, oh my goodness. And there's tears, there's all, you get in your car and you're crying and you're hoping the people beside you are not noticing you crying and all that. And then you've got to get to work. How am I going to do this? And then you get to work and you do that. You know, you take a big deep breath and you kind of stop the crying, and then you kind of, you know, you get to work, you compartmentalize, you're doing, all of a sudden, one of your friends at work comes out and says, how are you going? That's actually normal and good for us. That's what we call the waves. That process of moving is actually good for us. This ability to go between both the good and the bad is actually really good for us. And I'll tell you a little bit why that is later on neurobiologically. It's scary, but this sense of the movement is really important. It's where we feel like we get stuck. That's where things like the anxiety will take over. It's where we feel like we get stuck. There's no sense of movement happening inside us. And so grief is about these waves. So people often ask me, what's the words I would use around grief? And for me, strangely enough, the word I use more than anything is paradox. Grief is a paradoxical experience in so many ways, because it's at one moment you can hold the very worst of your life with the very best of your life. At one moment you can have a sense of total destruction of your world with a sense of rebuilding and reconstruction into your world. You can have these incredible senses of weakness, absolute weakness, and then this strange and unabiding, unexplainable strength that kind of comes up within you. This is the paradox of grief. And that's what makes it so confusing for lots of people, but it's absolutely natural and normal. It's an amazing, amazing process. And I kind of like to think of it in terms of this is the process. Grief has stayed around with us for every generation for reasons. It's grief is what's got us, and grieving has got us through the worst things, because what it is not a deficit. Grief is not a deficit. Grieving is not a deficit. It is an amazing healing process that can take us from total destruction to a sense of being able to tentatively take a step into a new world. That's why I kind of like to think of it in terms of the broken leg. If you absolutely smashed your leg, you wouldn't be expecting yourself to be jumping and running a marathon very quickly. It's a long process of healing. But the interesting thing is, guess what? We don't heal that broken leg. What actually happens is we find and we support that process, and that amazing process of healing actually occurs. And in many ways, that's the way grief works. It's an amazing human healing process. And I've been doing this work for kind of 40 years. And the more I work in it, the more I'm in awe of the power of grief and the human spirit to take people into places that you think, wow, this is impossible. And I'm dealing with all kinds of grief at all kinds of times. But I think it's being in awe of the process is often the power of the human spirit to come through some of the greatest adversity, including the power of the human spirit to grieve and heal through things such as cancer. And, grief is not new. We've got all this science about it, but it's actually not new. And a lot of our literature and our stories and our rituals are around the idea of grief, whatever that grief happens to be. And it's therefore a really human part of our experience. So, of course, it's also part of our scientific study. I'm not going to spend much time in this, but just to give you a bit of a flavour, of course, we've tried to study it scientifically. Now, I'm a psychologist by background. I'm also a mathematician by background. So, of course, you say to a mathematician, this is really complex, it's got to be able to be reduced to something. But it doesn't always work that way. This is what I love most about grief. If we're really honest, we would like to think that we could make grief fit into a nice little box that we could give to everyone, and it would explain it for everybody. We'd probably even be happy to have a few nice little neat boxes, but as long as they were nice and neat and they made sense. And the beauty of that, so we've tried to do that, particularly over the 20th century. We've tried to kind of make grief fit our ideas of nice little boxes. And this comes into the different models that, this is how it is and this is how you experience it. So we've tried to explain. So there's many boxes that people have tried to explain grief. There's from psychodynamic theory to attachment theory to task-based models to social construct. There's not the time to go through these today, but there's so many different ways of trying to understand that. When it comes down to actually living with illness and dying, of course, we've all heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work. But this idea, I remember when I first started working back 40 years ago on palliative care ideas, and I can remember, this idea that, oh, gee, we've now discovered how people deal with these situations. And so I can literally remember people saying, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, you can't be accepting your own death. You haven't been angry yet. Kubler-Ross never, ever spoke about wanting this to be prescriptive. It was more like what she saw in working with people was that she saw this kind of messy bog down there, and she saw a few little islands kind of coming up. But she really was talking about messiness, and she was trying to get a bit of it. But in Western societies, we love to have a prescription and say everybody has to experience that. That is not what she said at all. She said somewhere she saw some patterns starting to emerge through these things. But again, what she was talking about was what we see on the outside. A lot of people hadn't even thought about, well, why is that going on? Why is that happening underneath? And there's other stories that start to tell us about illness. This one came back in the 1970s, and I actually really like this, and it's really not recognized a lot. But sometimes in understanding how people even deal with treatments, we could see Lapowski's work actually spoke about how people see illness, and depending on how they see the illness can affect the way they'll actually react to it and to treatment. So, for example, he said some people saw illness as a challenge. Some people saw it as an enemy, some as punishment, some as a weakness. For some people, it was a relief because it took them away from responsibilities or problems they had. Some saw it as a strategy. For example, keeping a marriage together because, they had to stay and look after you. Some saw it as irreparable loss. He saw these different ways that people spoke. And he said, for example, this can affect. So if you, for example, if someone saw illness as a challenge versus someone who saw illness as a punishment, right? So someone who sees illness as a challenge goes, okay, give me this, I'll have a go at that, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that, whatever. They might have a very open attitude to treatment. But if someone sees illness as a punishment for something perhaps they've done, then sometimes they'll even resist treatment because they feel they need to be punished. So you can see what he was getting at was we need to understand the experience that people have around these things because that's very different. But my favorite model in terms of understanding grief, because it talks about this movement, is probably what we call the dual process model. Now, basically what it is talking about this same kind of thing. The loss-oriented things is those moments when all I want to do is sit down and have a good cry, and all I can think about is having cancer, and I don't tell me to be positive, and I just want to, really sit down in a corner somewhere and really just feel incredibly sad. But the reality is you don't get the right to do that a lot. You might have to look after kids. You might have to get the cookie. You might have to go to work still. You might have to, this is that restoration stuff. But what dual process and Strobe and Schutz said is it's not that both of those are part of the elements, as we said, getting in the car, getting to work, having a good cry. But what they actually said was it's the middle part that's the important thing. As we said, it's that ability to move between the two. Right? If you don't move, what they said was when people get into trouble is where they get stuck in one side or the other. So some people will get stuck in the loss oriented. All they can do is think about their distress. They stop being able to function in the world. Others say, I'm not even going to think about the right to be distressed. I'm not going to give myself the right to be, I'm just going to get on with it. They said neither of those actually works. It's the ability to oscillate, to move between the two that actually helps people feel a stronger sense of what they're doing there. So what I love about grief and why I've loved working in it is because grief just refuses to get in any box. It just won't get in the box. What we've actually come to learn is that over all these things, we start to put it together and we start to develop this emerging picture of this amazing human experience. Now, I'm going to give you a very short version because one of the beautiful things I love as a scientist, I've lived through the experiences, I have a very poetic side to me, but there's a strong scientific side to me. And what I love more than anything is the fact that the more we're learning, particularly about neurobiology, the more we're starting to understand why good theories and why good human experiences of understanding grief have stuck around. This is a very short version of neurobiology in terms of that. So very quickly, neuroscience is not another model of grief. It's an explanatory basis for what hangs around. Now, I know people don't know necessarily a lot, but I'm just going to have a very quick talk to you about the way the brain develops. Because our lived experience is in our brains. That's where we live. Most of what happens to us is inside ourselves. Only about 10% of what we perceive is external to us. Most of our lived experience is inside how we feel about it. As you're sitting in that chair in day surgery, most of what's going on is going on inside you. So to understand the brain, we need to understand the brain develops from back to front. So this back part of the brain, if you look at that diagram, the back part of the brain, the cerebellum there, to the front. So our brains develop from back to front, right-hand side to left-hand side, and inside to outside. Now, what that means is the back part of the brain is fully developed at birth, right? This is what babies survive in. This is why babies can't tell you my nappy is wet, but they feel distressed. That connection to our body, our absolute connection to our body, is fundamental to our experience. So whatever is happening in our body, whether it's cancer, is fundamental, is linked to that sense of what's going on in our minds. There's also the back part of our brain is our senses in terms of that. The front part of our brain is the last part to develop. That's where we have all the smart parts. the problem solving, the language, the thinking throughs, those things are really important. But if you have a look in that where that little red spot is in the middle, that middle part of our brain is actually called the limbic system. And this is actually where most of us live as children. It's 70% developed at birth. This is what we live in, and this has some really important parts. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So I've kind of mentioned that that's how the brain develops, and that we see that that limbic system and that midbrain actually develop. Now, so how does grief work? There's some really important things to think about, because the really important thing to realize is when you have a look at the brain of someone who is grieving versus someone who isn't, the bit that really is different and lights up in grieving people is that limbic system in the middle there. So that's important to remember, because it's also the part that lights up in anxiety. It's also the part that lights up in trauma. It's a really incredible important. It's what anyone who says we outgrow the child in us knows nothing about neurobiology. This is what we really experience. So let's have a think about what we know. So as we said, the back part of the brain develops first. That is our bodily connection. Your connection to your brain, and sometimes your body will kind of speak to your brain without using words. You sometimes know when you can feel it. You go, many people even say they even know if the treatment's working. There's a very strong connection people often have. Even we know with our gut biomes now, we've underestimated the connection between the brain, and that it's going both up to the brain and from the brain coming down. So we know about pain and all those kind of things, that the gate theories of pain suggest that it can go both ways. There's also movement, as I said. Movement is in the back part of the brain. When people are terrified, they almost go like this, right? It's like, and then as they start to relax, their arms start to move. That kind of thing happens. Movement's important. The senses are there, the sights, the sounds, the smells. Those things are really important. So they're a really detailed and important part of the lived experience of any kind of treatment. But in the front part of the brain, we have some really important bits. These are later developed. One is called autobiographical memory. This is where I make sense of the story of my life. This is how I put it into its chapters, and I get it to make sense, and I can put things into my life, and grief becomes important. And I'm helped there because this is also where my problem solving is, where I can think things through. It's also then where I can regulate my emotions. So instead of kind of being really distressed or really depressed, I can kind of keep them in the middle ground there. I can say to myself, calm down, this isn't going to help you. I'm using that front part of my brain to help me regulate my emotions. This is also where I have my social brain. This is the bit of me that wants to reach out to other people. This is the bit of me that wants to interact, that wants to seek support from other people. What you often find is when you're really distressed and you're in the back part of your brain, what you often find is, what do? You start withdrawing yourself from other people. You go into yourself, So there's that thing. Now, language is also in the front part of the brain. So this is where I start telling myself the way I should feel about things. And I can tell myself, oh, don't be so silly, whatever it is, or you're stupid, or you're not worth it, you did this to yourself, whatever. But as I said, the limbic system, episodic memory is also this. This is the memory that's kind of sends out there. It's the scary memories, and I can't make sense of it, and I can't bring it into that autobiographical. Now, this limbic system, because it's survival, has two major survival systems that children need. And the first is the center of threat. This is this is not even thinking threat. This is I put the washing out the line. I forgot I put it out the line. I go out to put the rubbish out. Something rustles. You're already in. It's the automatic response. So much of cancer treatment, so much of having is automatic threat. The other part that's about survival in the brain is attachments. Babies can't look after themselves. They have to be able. So these are fundamental. So I'm going to suggest to you what is fundamental about every human being is love and fear. Every philosophy, every religion, to some extent, realizes how much we put those things together. Grief is so much fear, so much threat, cancer diagnosis, all that threat, And sometimes that, people moving away from you, or that feel like you're a bad person, that love and fear becomes really prompt. Now, if you think about it, that was one of my favorite quotes, is recognizing this, was the great C.S. Lewis. And he wrote a little book that often people don't even realize. They know the Narnia's books, but they don't know one of the most amazing books he wrote was he wrote a little tiny book called Grief Observed, where C.S. Lewis wrote about the death of his wife. And he put in that book, my favorite quote about grief is the very first line of that book. He said, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I'm not afraid, but sensations like being afraid, the same flutterings in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning, I keep on swallowing." That sense of threat is such an integral part that not only are you grieving the loss, but as on top of that, the threats of treatment and all those means that threat is a really important part of what goes on. One of the other things that's really incredible is realizing that we like to live with certainty. And what cancer diagnosis does is throw you into the world of uncertainty. And it's really hard when we're used to living with certainty to live in a world of uncertainty, particularly if it's the first major experience of a distress in your life. And what we want to do is often try and force ourselves back in. But what's it like to live in the uncertain world? Well, one of the big things in uncertain was what we call just world theory. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. It kind of makes us feel safe in the world because we kind of tell ourselves then, well, of course, if I'm just a good person, then I can make good things happen. And a lot of people believe in just world theory. The problem with people such as yourselves is when loss comes into your life and a bad thing happens to a good person, that screws up the whole understanding of the world. You've either got to try and hang on to just world theory, or you've actually got to give it up, which means then you have to put up with things just happen and it's not due to the value of the person. That can be a really scary place to step into, in sense of that loss of control. But some people won't be able to give it up. And so you've probably already heard that. May not be you, but it may be other people around you. They need just world theory. So what they've got to do is, if a bad thing like cancer happens to a good person, they've got to try and make that fit again. So they'll do things like make the bad thing less bad. Oh, well, you'll get over it. They've got good treatments now. At least it's not that kind of cancer. They'll try to bring that bad thing closer to it not being bad. And if they can't do it, then they've got to bring the good person back to being bad. Well, maybe if you hadn't smoked, maybe if you hadn't done this, maybe if you'd been more careful with your diet, most of it is not about you. It's not about you. It's about them feeling safe. But it often makes people feel that they feel misunderstood, because to give up just world theory is really scary for a lot of people. The world of uncertainty often challenges all our beliefs about ourselves and others, and who we thought we could trust and how we thought the world would be. We've actually got to develop new worlds, new beliefs for a new world. And that's really hard, because where do you start with? It's like someone blew the whole thing apart. You've got to rebuild it. We talk about problem management skills. Problem management skills are, I have a problem, I have a solution, and I just work hard at it. The problem is when you live in a world that you can't control all the time, that doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, we just start working harder. And if that doesn't work, we start getting anxious. And if that doesn't work, we start getting angry and we start blaming ourselves. What we actually know what works in this world is what we call problem appraisal skills. What can I control? What can't I control? What am I responsible for? And what am I not responsible for? We start to begin to concentrate only on what we can control and what we are responsible for. And we learn to build scenarios. There's other things in the uncertain world, things like things need to work out in a specific way. But when you live in that, I'll just do the best I can. We actually change the way we look at the world. Change is not safe in a certain world. But, for some of us, there is no way to get to growth unless you go through uncertainty. So what I'm getting at here is that what many of you are being forced into is what you don't want. You don't have a choice, but you don't get that choice. And the skills of living in uncertainty are things like being able to plan it, controlling your emotions, confronting, see, all those things. But when you step into an uncertain world where you don't know how it's going to go, you often have to develop new skills and different skills, being present, being calm, learning how to build scenarios, working how to change direction. These are really big things that are forcing just at a time when you haven't even really got the resources to do it. So just a couple of terms I want to, before I kind of get to finish off, a couple of terms that are really important in beyond, if you think about loss beyond bereavement. One is what we call the concept of disenfranchised grief. That's grief that other people don't get to let them have. So, for example, I think like a miscarriage is often a really good example of disenfranchised grief, where, oh, well, you just have another baby, or, disenfranchised grief, the grief of a mistress when there's been a death. This is what we mean. Often people who are intellectually challenged don't get the right to grieve. But in your situations, sometimes, for example, someone who gets lung cancer without smoking, right, will get more right to grieve than someone who perhaps has smoked all their life and got cancer. It's that disenfranchisement of some kinds of grief. Some people will get, oh, well, if they get over it, they're not allowed to feel bad about it because that other person isn't getting over it. So it's this disenfranchised grief where people don't get a right to grieve and they just learn to be quiet about it. There's another thing called ambiguous loss, and this is a really big thing for dealing with cancer, is do I have a loss to grieve or not? I'm not actually sure I do, because I might get better. I may not get better. So do I actually kind of grieve the loss and kind of prepare for the worst and go through the loss and deal with that? Or is that giving up? And it's really this in two minds, is what we call ambiguous loss. What do I do with this? How do I actually deal with something where I don't know the outcome? It's that full of that uncertainty. And that's what we mean by ambiguous loss. Another one that people often talk about is this idea of anticipatory grief and anticipatory mourning. And you know what I'm talking about, particularly with elderly people. My dad's terminal at the moment. He's 96. But already, the response is, oh, well, he's 96, he's going to die. And that's already being kind of thought through, so that when you go to when I go to my dad's funeral, it'll be, well, he had a good innings and all, which is true to some extent, but it doesn't mean that we don't grieve him as much as what we do. And I spoke as a cancer nurse so many times with people, even if they knew a death was coming and I sat with them, that moment it happened was still as difficult for those people. And that's why my favorite quote is written by, looking at the literature, was a beautiful quote that was written. It says, "The rehearsal is not the same as the main act." And I think that's a wonderful way to look at this idea of anticipatory grief in terms of that. So one concept is this idea of chronic sorrow. When we talk about grief, we often think about a bereavement type of grief, where you have a bad thing happen and then over time it eases off. Much of what many of you will be dealing with is what we call a chronic sorrow type of grief. And this is kind of an ongoing kind of grief. I use this diagram, it's a bit like this, all right? So it's what we know about is kind of what we call episodic. So what'll happen is you'll have, above the line there is good days. There are days when you feel really good and you're doing really well, right? And then there are days where don't come near you because you're just not doing really well, right? And what we know with chronic sorrow is it has this pattern to it. It's kind of an episodic pattern. And what's chronic sorrow is that people will go, oh, I feel really, really bad in a while. And then all of a sudden they'll start to come out of it a couple of days later and go, I don't know what I was doing feeling so bad. This chronic sorrow pattern is really important. And what I'm getting at here with this diagram is, in a family, you have one person who has a certain pattern, but the partner or the kids will have a different pattern. And this mess is what's happening for a lot of people dealing with chronic conditions. And I put this up once nearly 35 years ago in a multiple sclerosis conference, and people had never heard this concept of chronic sorrow. The whole room, there's about 300 people in the room, just went to tears, because what this said to these families was, you're not mad, bad, or inadequate feeling like you're not coping with this kind of stuff. but it is not depression. And it's really important to realize these are self-limiting. If you went to your GP or to your doctor on those down days, you'd probably be diagnosed as depressed. But it's not the same pattern as depression. It's a movement of pattern again, ups and downs, and it's got a very definite pattern to it. I'm not going to mention this in detail, but it's something also to be aware of, that people, another whole challenge is dealing with trauma. Some people find the treatment process is actually traumatic events, and we need to be aware of that can be really difficult for people. I'll leave that because time's running out. So three words, respect, understanding, and enablement. The first one is absolutely vital, and it doesn't matter what we're doing, is we need to respect your experience, those experiences. We need to have deep, deep respect. Nothing we do is worth it unless we hold this deepest of respect for both the experience of grief, for the griever, for the power of the human spirit, for the invitation to be invited into this experience. It's absolutely the fundamental core foundation. The next word is understand, respect, understanding. As a psych, we like to use these words like assessment and all that. But I'm going to tell you, from when you actually look, when I start to look at the literature, there's actually 10 questions of loss. None of them you ask. But it helps us understand the loss experience. But understanding 10 questions is really difficult. This little diagram that actually helped. There's the world that was, that's where I want to be, and the world that is. And between those two worlds is a dirty big piece of perspex glass. And on the side in the world that is this person who doesn't want to be there. The person who's got cancer, kind of banging themselves head against the wall because they can see where they wanted to be when they were healthy, when there were things were going on. And it's this grief is being able to see where you want to be and not being able to get back to that. And the process of normal grief is being able to eventually turn your head and move out into this new world. But it's really scary, and there's all kinds of different roads that we need to work through. At the top there, those arrows suggest there are some things in the world that was that will remain in the world that is. It might be for kids, school, it might be a relationship, it might be whatever. Some things, because those arrows, they're suggesting that some things are refracted, they need a little bit of help. It might be a marital relationship or something that needs a bit of work to help someone support someone. Those arrows going backwards, though, at the top are my Star Trek kind of days. This is the force fields. This is the stuff that keeps my face trained onto the world that was. I can't turn my head. I can't make a way into this. That's where I argue, that's the only place I argue that people like me who work as therapists get involved. It's about breaking that force field. That might be through guilt or trauma or all kinds of things to help people deal with that. So the natural process of moving. So that's where the 10 questions come in. When I think about the world that was, I want to know what's been lost, all those kinds of losses we spoke about, how important they are to the person. When I think about the person down here, I want to know what their symptoms, what are they experiencing? What's their lived experience? What's the symptoms for them? And are there any causing them particular trouble, like guilt or trauma or whatever it might be? What's the road to healing? How far are they? Are they just at the beginning, or have they really moved their way through this? What's their world like? What's the strengths in it? What's the things that can be rebuilt into it? What's the hindrances? What's those blocks? If anybody wants to learn that in more detail, I kind of end up writing this in a book. It's actually published in the UK, Understanding Loss, back there. So there's a whole lot of, all this stuff I've spoken about is there. So I want to finish off then with one of my favorite. When I think about grief, and I apologize to anybody, I can never say this right, but Kinzitsu, this is for me a beautiful concept of the way we actually understand loss. We in Western societies, when something is broken, we want to fix it by pretending that we put the glue so that it never actually looks like it was broken. This incredibly beautiful Japanese art is called the art of the broken pieces. Basically what it is this absolute idea of repairing broken things with silver and gold, with the idea that something broken can actually become even more beautiful than it was without disguising the scars. And I often think when I think about loss, that's the way loss becomes. We're never the same, but for many of you, this experience will bring a beauty that people often themselves aren't even aware of. And it's believing in that through that uncertain road and that difficult road that actually is the gift that you will bring through this experience to others as well. And I will leave it there.
Wow, so much to think about. Thank you. That's sort of unbelievably comprehensive talk. I was looking up your book actually as well because I'm going to put a link to that on the write-up of this event. So thank you. We've got some comments and questions, and it's been noted that so, I'm not going to use names actually because I think sometimes it's better to remain anonymous. But it's been noted that some people have a lot of finances, which was big for them, and also it's been mentioned that somebody lost their friends. I think you commented on losing people through the cancer journey. There's also finances
Yeah,
can
absolutely.
be, yeah. And then we have some questions. We have 3 questions. If we go over time, that's fine. A little bit over time, if you don't mind, Judith, because it might take a bit of time to answer these. We've got my friend won't have treatment because she thinks her stress caused her cancer, and she can cure it by not having more stress. What can I say to her? And I think there's the question after that is similar. It's I also have a friend who won't have treatment because she says she feels she caused her cancer because of spiritual issues. So is there anything that you can say? Is there any comment that you have on that or any advice?
Yeah, look, so it's one of the things is acknowledging people where they're at, and a lot of that is acknowledging where the fear is. So one of the things is I actually find it becomes important to be able to speak to people where they're at, and it's also why I always have on board, if I need to, other religious leaders and people who that. But one of the things that often comes down is the ability to forgive, and that's where some of this world of uncertainty comes in. You're changing those belief patterns in that it's actually okay to be scared, it's actually okay to feel that. But I come back to some of these ideas for some of these people, and I can only speak from a Christian perspective, so I apologize to anybody in any other religion. But when you look at I find that faith challenges are big things for people. And so working from this idea of the law versus the gospel. And what this idea of the gospel is about being open to forgiveness and kindness and love and those kinds of things. And what is the experience of being gentle with the child inside us, with the experience of fear? You have to sit with people in that rubble, and the relationship you have. You say, "I have a friend." That's the most important thing you give to those people at that time. If you try to give too much advice, what'll happen is they'll just go defensive. But to sit in that rubble with them, to hear them express their fear, to let them express what that fear is, to say, if they feel they're being punished spiritually, say, what's would you punish someone? How would that be? Is that the kind of religion? Is that the kind of God you believe in? Really exploring with them where that's come from. You often find in these situations that what you've got is you've had a childhood belief system that's really strong, that's often been traumatized or whatever. And again, but it is one where I think we have to acknowledge those issues, but as Lapowski said, it does affect our people. If you see illness as punishment, then it is really difficult. So it's actually looking at the illness and reinterpreting that for them. And it can take quite a lot of time for people. We've seen this happen. For example, Australia's just started with the voluntary assisted dying, and some of the issues that have come up with that have been, um, that people have a right to make that choice. But even for the people supporting them, is that they go, really, that choice was made when they're in childhood, and it's not the choice that they would like to see someone make, but it's a right to make it. So these issues come up. but we can't always fix everyone. But what you can do is do exactly what you said you are. I have a friend. That's the most important thing that you offer, is to sit in the rubble, to hear the confusion, to not have to find the answer to the confusion, but to let that confusion come out, and then just quietly go, hang on, I'm a bit confused. You said that, but then you kind of would defend anybody. I don't get that. You would never
Mm.
speak to, how come there's rules for other people that you treat them that way, but you don't treat yourself that way? So you can gently challenge some of that work, but you've got to have that relationship that's clear and non-judgmental, which is the beauty of you saying, I have a friend.
Mm.
Don't
They say,
underestimate that.
and they say thank you. So, and then we have, thank you for that. And they have another question or statement, which is very timely. Is I have had a pneumonectomy, whole lung removed, on 29th of July 2024. So that's quite recent, due to rare type of lung cancer, mucoepidermoid carcinoma. I won't be able to, sorry, it's moving. I won't be able to return to work as special needs teacher due to the physical and psychological demands that I won't be able to deal with now, given my health condition. Never smoked and otherwise healthy, apart from being misdiagnosed in 2018 with adult onset asthma that turned out to be my lung cancer. I'm so sorry. Still processing the diagnosis, earning capacity, change in relationship, and grieving for what I thought my future held. Thank you for your talk, and Cancer for organising it. You're very welcome. Very timely for me personally. I only found out about it 3 hours before it started tonight. I'm in Sydney, Australia. All the best to everyone on their health journey. Thank you very much. And they also say I feel angry. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Judith.
Anger is
Um,
totally normal. I mean,
mm,
that's anger is some of the fightness, that I have a real problem with those words, fight, flight, and freeze, because what we do is we put value judgments on those words. We put value judgments on, and what they are is the way we try to react to any kind of threat. We fight, but it's not about, we always think fight, we go, that's a terrible person, an angry person, you shouldn't be like that, it's aggression. And we think flight is, oh, that's people who run away. That's not what it is at all. What it is fight is I use my energy to face my foe, right? So that can be incredibly positive, to taking action, going to treatment. But, and flight can be, I use my energy to move away from my foe. So I don't expose myself to having to have great discussions about this, or I reduce my amount of, learning too much or hearing too much or whatever it might be. Freeze is, it's okay to have one of those days where all you want to do is sit on the couch, and it's where the threat keeps building up. And from that lovely discussion that someone said to, just had then, the threats just keep building up. You lose work, you lose this, the threats. And so naturally, the more the threat is, the more we move down the continuum. So then we go from taking action to getting angry and blaming ourselves. So anger is totally a natural part of feeling threatened if you can't feel in control of all the stuff going on around you, which is natural, right? It's a natural experience to do that. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean, it just means there's so much threat going on. So we need to work at pulling some of the threat down. If with flight, it goes from, I reduce my exposure, I do want to run away, right? And freezing is goes from, it's okay to have one of those days on the couch, to I'm depressed and I'm numb. It just means we've got so much threat going on, and we need to go, that lovely person who just wrote there, I've lost my job, I've lost my future. That's why loss is such an important understanding for me, is because once you understand all the losses, then all the threat starts to make sense, and we can start to work on each loss and go, okay, my loss of my work, that's going to have a different way of dealing with that than the loss of my sense of the future or the loss of my relationships. We start to be able to say, let's do this little bit at a time, and we can start to what we can control, rather than this whole amorphous lump of threat that just keeps building and building and building, wants to blow up inside us.
Thank you. Thank you. I think this has been a very valuable talk, and it's going to be with us to come. So a lot of people will be able to hear what you've had to say.